everyone, it's Nora here from Nora's Ark, and today we're here to talk about a cool trick to get your sourdough starter started, no pun intended. And that cool trick is this fermentation lid. But before we get into how that works, let's talk about why we came to this conclusion. So like all great learning experiences, the first time that we attempted to get a sourdough starter going, we failed. So then we had to reevaluate and understand why that happened and how we could prevent it from happening in the future. The reason that we failed on our first one was because our first sourdough starter molded. So then we started to research why did that happen? And it was because we found that it was because too much outside air had gotten into our sourdough starter. And we couldn't really find a good answer for how to prevent that from happening. So then we were just thinking about it and doing more research, and all of a sudden a light bulb went off. And we're like, why don't we use a fermentation lid? We have a lot of these laying around because we've done a lot of other fermentation projects. We've done wine, we've done pickles, hot sauce, sauerkraut, you name it, we've probably fermented it at some point. And we were like, the fermentation lid will work perfectly for this, because what a fermentation lid does is it doesn't let outside air in, but it lets gases escape. And that's really important. So the first time that we did it, we used a regular lid and we had it screwed on, but not all the way tight. So that way gases could escape, but outside air couldn't get in. But obviously we learned that outside air was getting in because ours molded. So let's talk about how this lid works. I just mentioned it makes sure that air doesn't get in, but it lets gases escape. And the way it does that is it has a rubber gasket on the lid, so it's a tight seal, but then this airlock lets gases escape. And as you can see, we've been really successful with this method because our sourdough is really bubbly, it's really active. This rubber band is the level that it was at when we started it. So it's definitely growing, and that's what you want to see. When we first started getting into sourdough, we thought it was really complicated. There was a lot of information out there, and we started to feel overwhelmed. But with anything that seems that way, it's best to just try it. So that's what we did, and we're here to tell you that it's really easy, and with this fermentation lid, we think it makes it even easier. So now you're probably wondering, how do I get my own started? And as I mentioned, it's very easy. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna start with equal parts water and equal parts flour in a jar. Then you're gonna mix it together. For our recipe, we did 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour. And it's important to use a scale because you wanna be super precise with your measurements. So then what you'll do is you'll let it sit for 3 days. And then after that, you're gonna discard half of it, and then you're gonna feed it with the same amount of water and flour. So 60 grams water, 60 grams flour. You'll repeat that process for a total of about 7 to 14 days. And that timing can just depend on a lot of things. It can depend on the temperature of your house. It can depend on the humidity, your environment. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. Ours took about 10 days before we noticed that it was ready. And I'll talk about how you can tell if it's ready or not in a minute. And then 2 other things that I want to talk about that are pretty important is the water and the flour. So first off, we have a well, so we don't have to worry about chemicals in our water that could inhibit the fermentation process. So for example, chlorine can inhibit the fermentation process, and you can find that in tap water if you have city water. If you have tap water, city water, you'll either want to get some filtered water from the store, or you can boil it and let some of those chemicals off gas, or let it sit out overnight. There's a few different ways. So if you don't have a well, just look into that before you just put your water into the jar, because that's pretty important. And then the other aspect that's important, the flour. When you first start it, you're going to want to use a more nutritious flour, so rye flour or whole wheat flour. We started with whole wheat flour. But then when you feed it on days 3 to 14, you can use all-purpose flour. And you'll want to do that because otherwise it'll get pretty expensive to keep on feeding it with whole wheat flour or rye flour every day. So you can switch to all-purpose flour after you've got it started. And the reason for that is just these flours have more nutrition in them, so it helps boost your sourdough starter when you first start it. Let's talk about how you know it's ready, because that's the most important part, right? The point of making the starter is so that we can bake with it. So we want to know when it's ready. The first thing you'll notice is the size. And that's why we put the rubber band on it, so that way we can tell how much it's growing. When it's doubled in size, usually that means that it's ready. It'll also be very bubbly, and the texture will be kind of like melted marshmallows. So it'll be really spongy, airy. There's going to be a lot of bubbles, and it's going to be doubled in size. It'll also have a particular smell. It'll smell like yeast or bread or a beer. And then other ways that you can know that it's ready, or you can be absolutely sure that it's ready, is you can do a float test. And what that means is you just take a bowl of water, and then you just take a little bit less than a spoonful of your starter, and you'll just drop it into the bowl. And if it floats, then you know that it's ready to go. I hope that this video was helpful for all of you out there who are trying to get your sourdough started and maybe not having the best of luck. And I also hope it's helpful for sourdough people who've been doing this a long time, and maybe they want to try and see if this gets their sourdough a little bit more active. But anyways, we used our sourdough starter to make a focaccia bread earlier today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to dig into that now.